Nevada sells the world a postcard of neon lights, blackjack tables, and easy luck. But behind that image is another Nevada entirely, one built by blood, fear, and men so brutal the prison gates didn't stop the terror, they only contained it. In this countdown, we're looking at the 10 most notorious inmates ever locked up in Nevada. Number 10. Gerald Gallego. Gerald Gallego did not hunt alone. He hunted with his wife sitting right beside him. And that is the part that still makes this case feel especially rotten. Most people know to be careful around the angry guy in the parking lot. They do not expect danger to show up as a couple, with a woman helping start the conversation and a man stepping in once it is too late. That was Gerald's edge. He understood that people drop their guard faster when evil looks normal. By the late 1970s, Gallego was already a seasoned criminal with a record full of fraud, violence, and fake identities. Then he met Charlene Williams, and the two of them turned that mess into something colder and far more organized. Prosecutors later tied the couple to a string of murders across California, Nevada, and Oregon. The pattern was simple, which is usually a bad sign. A victim would be approached in a parking lot, outside a shopping center, or after a night out. Charlene would help make the contact. Gerald would take control. Then the victim would be forced into a car, driven somewhere isolated, and never make it home. What made Gallego stand out was not just the cruelty, it was the control. He was not some wild man stumbling from one crime to the next. He planned, he adapted, and he kept moving. He knew how to talk, how to bluff, how to use fake names, and how to make himself seem smaller than the threat he really was. That is usually how men like this get away with so much for so long. They do not look like movie monsters. They look like somebody you might ignore for 5 seconds, which is all they need. The case finally broke in November of 1980 after Gerald and Charlene abducted Craig Miller and Mary Beth Sowers in Sacramento. This time, a witness noticed enough to remember the license plate, and that tiny detail blew the whole thing open. Suddenly, the couple was running, changing names, changing their appearance, and bouncing across state lines like they could somehow outdrive the truth. They were arrested in Omaha, Nebraska, and the performance ended there. Gallego was later convicted in both California and Nevada and sent to death row in both states, which is about as clear a public review as a man can get. He died of cancer in prison in 2002. Gerald Gallego was terrifying for one reason above all. He turned ordinary moments into traps, and he used trust like it was just another weapon. Number 9. Patrick McKenna. On the morning of January 6, 1979, guards at the Clark County Jail found 20-year-old Jack Nobles dead in his cell. He had been strangled in the night. No outsider had slipped through a fence. No masked man had come through a door. The man blamed for it was already inside the jail, already behind bars, already exactly where the state thought danger was supposed to stop. His name was Patrick McKenna, and that was the problem with McKenna. Locking him up never seemed to end anything. It just changed the address. By the time Nobles was killed, McKenna had already spent years proving he was not some man who made one terrible choice and then fell apart. Violence followed him like it paid rent. He went to prison young for violent crimes, escaped once, joined another escape attempt that turned into a hostage situation, and later stabbed a correctional officer with a homemade knife. Somehow, after all that, he was paroled. Looking back, that decision aged about as well as milk in the desert. In July 1978, just months before Nobles was found dead, McKenna attacked 2 women at a Las Vegas motel. According to court records, he used a knife, forced them from room to room, tied them up, sexually assaulted them, and robbed them. Most men would have ended their story right there, with enough horror for one lifetime. McKenna kept going. Then came the jail killing. Witnesses later described an argument inside the cell after lockdown. By morning, Nobles was dead, and McKenna was on his way to death row. Even that did not bring calm. Later that same year, he was involved in an armed takeover during an escape attempt at the Las Vegas annex of the Clark County Jail. Years later, when he had to appear in court, officials treated him less like a normal inmate and more like a live wire. He wore leg restraints, a stun belt, and sat under heavy security, with SWAT officers watching the room. That kind of setup tells you something simple. Nobody in that building trusted him for a second. McKenna's case dragged on for decades through reversals, retrials, and repeated death sentences. But the strange part is that after all the violence, all the fear, and all the years Nevada spent trying to finish his case, the state never executed him. Patrick McKenna died in 2021 at 74, still on death row. He is remembered not because of one night, but because every place built to control him somehow ended up proving the same ugly point. For some men, prison is the end of the story. For Patrick McKenna, it was just another place where the story got worse. Number 8. Ammar Harris. Ammar Harris did not just kill a man in Las Vegas. He turned one late-night feud into a fire on the Strip, the kind that leaves innocent people dead and makes a city built on lights and tourists look like a crime scene. In the early morning of February 21, 2013, Harris was out near the Las Vegas Strip after a night at Aria. Somewhere along the way, things went bad between his group and another man, Kenneth Cherry. By the time they got back into their cars, this was no longer drunk talk or club drama. Harris was angry, armed, and stupid enough to act on it in one of the busiest places in America. According to prosecutors, Harris got into an SUV with his girlfriend and followed Cherry's Maserati onto Las Vegas Boulevard. That detail matters because this was not some empty road at 3 in the morning. This was the Strip. There were other drivers, other passengers, other people just trying to get home. Harris pulled up next to Cherry's car, words were exchanged, and then Harris opened fire. Cherry was hit behind the wheel and lost control almost immediately. His Maserati slammed into several vehicles and then crashed into a taxi. The impact turned that cab into an inferno. Cherry died. Taxi driver Michael Bolden died. Passenger Sandra Sutton Wasmond died. Freddie Walters, who was riding with Cherry, survived with gunshot wounds. That is what made this case so brutal. Harris may have come looking for one man, but he made strangers pay for it too. 2 of the people who died had nothing to do with his argument, nothing to do with his ego, and nothing to do with whatever point he thought he was proving that night. After the shooting, Harris ran. Police tracked him to California less than a week later, and he was sent back to Nevada to face trial. Prosecutors argued that this was not some sudden loss of control. It was a deliberate act of violence carried out in public with deadly consequences that kept growing long after the shots were fired. A jury agreed. Harris was convicted on multiple charges, including first-degree murder, and was sentenced to death. That is the story of Ammar Harris in plain terms. He did not just start a fight. He pulled a gun in the middle of Las Vegas and turned a personal beef into 3 deaths, a burning taxi, and one of the Strip's most infamous killings. Number 7. Darren Mack. Most divorce cases end with paperwork, bad blood, and 2 people telling their friends they got screwed. Darren Mack turned his into a murder scene and a courthouse shooting before the day was even over. On the surface, Mack looked like a man who had already won at life. He was wealthy, well-known in Reno, and had the kind of image people trust too easily. Successful businessman, family man, polished guy. But by 2006, that image was cracking hard. He was locked in a vicious divorce with his wife, Charla, and the fight was not just emotional, it was financial, public, and getting uglier by the month. The court had ordered him to pay her thousands of dollars, and according to investigators, Mack was furious.
People that have never experienced this, it sounds almost like you're trying to tell a story about how Martians have landed, because it sounds so unbelievable unless you've actually been in it or been around his courtroom. But if you check on the internet, there's many like myself that have been fallen prey to his tyranny and his abuse in his courtroom. I can't even speak of what the cost will be from the retaliation that I'll get from the court system of Chuck Weller. It's even going through it, it's hard to keep your mind around that this kind of tyranny and this kind of injustice could happen in the United States. It just doesn't make any sense.
Not just at Charla, but at the judge handling the case, Family Court Judge Chuck Weller. Then came June 12th. That morning, Charla Mack was found stabbed to death in the garage of the family's Reno home. It was not some random act, and it was not some mystery out on a dark road. This was close, personal, and brutal. But what made the case truly shocking was what happened next. Just hours later, Judge Weller was sitting in his courthouse office when a shot came through the window and struck him in the chest. That is the part that made people stop and stare. This was no longer just a domestic homicide. This looked like a man taking his private rage and aiming it at the justice system itself. Prosecutors believed Mack went after the two people he blamed most for the collapse of his life, his wife and the judge overseeing the divorce. That is not losing control for a second. That is a man deciding other people were going to pay for his humiliation. After the attacks, Mack fled to Mexico, kicking off a high-profile manhunt. He was eventually tracked down and surrendered at a luxury resort, which is a very Darren Mack detail. Even as a fugitive, he still managed to run from murder charges with country club energy. In court, Mack later claimed the stabbing was self-defense. That did not carry the day. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in Charla's death and resolved the case involving the shooting of Judge Weller through a plea deal. By then, the polished image was dead too. And that is what makes Darren Mack so chilling. He was not some lifelong street criminal. He was a rich, respectable man who had every chance to walk away, cool off, and live with losing. Instead, he made sure other people paid first. Number 6. Zane Floyd. Before sunrise in Las Vegas, Zane Floyd told a terrified young woman something that should have sounded too sick to be real. He said he wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. That was not some drunken line from a man trying to sound dangerous. A few minutes later, he walked into a grocery store with a shotgun and started finding out. Floyd was 23 years old, a former Marine, and by the summer of 1999, his life was coming apart in a very ugly way. He had a history of heavy drinking, drug use, anger problems, and mental issues that people around him had seen building for years. He was broke, unstable, and running on the kind of self-destruction that usually ends in jail, a morgue, or both. In the early hours of June 3rd, he called for a young woman to come to his place, then pulled a shotgun on her and sexually assaulted her. During that attack, he told her he wanted to know what killing felt like, and he said he had enough shells to kill the first people he saw. Then he gave her a short head start and let her run, which somehow makes the whole thing even worse. It was not mercy, it was intermission. Floyd changed into camouflage, grabbed his shotgun, and walked to a nearby Albertsons supermarket. It was around 5:15 in the morning, the kind of quiet hour when workers are stocking shelves and trying to wake up before the city does. Nobody in that store was expecting to meet a man treating random murder like an item on his to-do list. Once inside, Floyd opened fire on strangers. In just a few minutes, he murdered 4 people: Thomas Darnell, Carlos Leos, Dennis Sargent, and Lucille Tarantino. He also shot and badly wounded Zachary Emenegger, who survived by playing dead. Other employees and customers hid wherever they could, while Floyd moved through the store, pulling the trigger on people who had never even seen him before that morning. When he came back outside, police were already there. He put the gun to his own head, threatened suicide, then surrendered after a short standoff. Later, he admitted what he had done. A jury convicted Zane Floyd of 4 counts of first-degree murder, along with sexual assault, kidnapping, attempted murder, and other charges. He was sentenced to death, and his case later turned into one of Nevada's longest legal battles over execution. But the heart of this case is much simpler and much darker. Zane Floyd did not kill for money, revenge, or power. He killed because he wanted to see what it felt like, and 4 innocent people became his answer. Number 5. Scott Dozier. Most men on death row spend years trying to stay alive. Scott Dozier spent his trying to get the state of Nevada to kill him. That alone sounds insane, but it was only the final chapter. Before he became the inmate begging for execution, Dozier had already been linked to 2 brutal murders tied to the meth trade, and both cases left behind the kind of details that stick to a story like blood on concrete. Dozier lived in that familiar Southwest underworld of cheap motels, drug deals, lies, and people who kept pretending they were in control right up until they weren't. Meth ran through his life like a live wire. So did paranoia. In that world, every partner can turn into a witness, every witness can turn into a problem, and sometimes the solution is murder. In Arizona, Dozier was convicted in the killing of Jason Green, a man whose body was later found buried in the desert. That case alone was enough to brand him as dangerous. But the Las Vegas case was the one that pushed him all the way to death row. Prosecutors said Jeremiah Miller came to Vegas with cash to buy chemicals connected to meth production. Instead, he vanished. Days later, workers found human remains stuffed inside a suitcase in a dumpster. Investigators said the body was Miller's. Parts of him were never recovered. That is the point where this stops sounding like a drug case and starts sounding like pure human wreckage. A Nevada jury convicted Dozier of first-degree murder and robbery, and the state sentenced him to die. But Scott Dozier became famous for something even stranger than the murders. He stopped fighting the sentence. He gave up his appeals. He pushed for his own execution. While most death row inmates were trying to buy time, Dozier was basically telling Nevada to quit dragging its feet and get on with it. And Nevada still couldn't do it. The state ran straight into legal fights over lethal injection drugs. Court hearings piled up. Execution plans got delayed. A pharmaceutical company even fought to block one of its drugs from being used. So the man who wanted to die ended up trapped inside a system too slow, too messy, and too tangled to finish what it started. In January 2019, Scott Dozier was found dead in his cell at Ely State Prison, ruled a suicide. After 2 murder cases, years on death row, and all that legal chaos, Nevada never executed him. In the end, the state lost the race to kill Scott Dozier to Scott Dozier himself. Number 4. Carroll Cole. Carroll Cole should have been stopped long before he ever reached death row. That is the part that sticks with you. This was not a killer who came out of nowhere. Years before the murders were fully tied to him, Cole had already told police he had violent urges toward women. He spent time in mental hospitals, showed clear signs of instability, and kept moving through the system like a problem nobody wanted to fully own. Looking back, it feels less like nobody saw the danger, and more like everybody saw it, then hoped it would become someone else's problem. Cole was born in 1938 and grew up in a deeply troubled home. Later in life, he blamed much of his hatred of women on his mother. That does not excuse anything, and it does not make his story tragic in some poetic way. It just helps explain how rage, shame, and violence kept showing up in the same ugly pattern. He drank heavily, drifted from state to state, and lived the kind of life that always seemed one step away from disaster. By the late 1970s and into 1980, disaster had a body count. Cole was eventually convicted of 5 murders in Nevada and Texas, all involving women. His method was brutally simple. He met women in bars, earned their trust, got them alone, and strangled them. There was no genius to it, no master plan, just close, personal violence carried out by a man who had been giving off warning signs for years. And even 5 may not have been the full story. Cole later confessed to more murders than the courts were ever able to prove. Some investigators could not confirm all of them, and that matters because serial killers are not exactly known for being humble or reliable narrators. Some of what he said may have been true. Some of it may have been ego talking. Either way, the murders that were proven were already enough to show exactly what he was. Then came the final twist. Most men on death row cling to every appeal, every delay, every extra year. Carroll Cole did the opposite. He gave up his appeals and moved the process forward.
Do you deserve to die? I can't answer that question.
No, it's the ultimate question. It is the question.
For what I did, yes, I think I deserve to die.
In 1985, Nevada executed him by lethal injection. So the most chilling part of Carroll Cole's story is not just that he killed women. It is that he kept signaling over and over that he was dangerous, and the system still managed to act shocked when the killing stopped being a threat and turned into a fact. Number 3. Jeremiah Bean. One of the worst details in the Jeremiah Bean case is that one of his victims stopped because he thought somebody needed help. That is the kind of detail that sticks with people, because it turns the whole story from brutal to just plain rotten. In May 2013, during Mother's Day weekend in Nevada, Bean went on a violent spree that left 5 people dead across 3 separate crime scenes, and the way it unfolded makes him sound less like a criminal genius and more like what he really was: a reckless, greedy man with no brakes left. It started in Fernley at the home of Robert and Dorothy Pape, an elderly couple in their 80s. Prosecutors said Bean broke into their house, shot Dorothy while she was in bed, then killed Robert when he came inside to see what was happening. After that, he stole their truck, their valuables, and one of their guns, because apparently robbery was not enough unless he could make it even worse on the way out. Later, Bean got that stolen truck stuck near Mustang, not far from Interstate 80. That is where Eliezer Graham, a newspaper delivery driver, pulled over to help. Graham was just doing what decent people do when they see someone stranded on the side of the road. Bean shot him, took his vehicle, and kept moving. That part matters because it tells you this was not panic and it was not some split-second accident. By then, Bean was already treating other people's lives like obstacles. Then he went back to Fernley and, according to prosecutors, returned to the Papes' property, moved stolen items around, and set part of the scene on fire. After that, he went to another house where Angie Duff and Lester Lieber were inside. Duff tried to get away. Lieber fought back. Both were killed. At that point, Bean had turned one break-in into a chain of murder, robbery, car theft, and arson, all in a single weekend. Police caught up with him near the last crime scene. He was wearing blood-stained shorts, carrying keys linked to the victims' vehicles, and surrounded by evidence that stacked up fast. At trial, prosecutors argued that Bean murdered 5 strangers for money, guns, and the chance to keep running a little longer. A jury convicted him of 5 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death. What makes Jeremiah Bean especially disturbing is that there was no big, clever master plan here. Just greed, violence, and a man who crossed the line early, then kept going like there was nothing left to stop him. Number 2. Michael Sonner. It started over $22 in stolen gas, which sounds like the kind of petty nonsense that usually ends with a ticket, a tow truck, and somebody giving a bored excuse in court. But on November 30th, 1993, that tiny theft put Nevada Highway Patrol Trooper Carlos Borland in the path of Michael Sonner, and once that happened, the whole thing turned deadly fast. Borland pulled over a red Chevy Blazer near Lovelock after it left a truck stop without paying. From his side of the window, this looked routine. Annoying, maybe, but routine. What he could not see was that Sonner was already a fugitive out of North Carolina, driving a stolen vehicle, using stolen plates, and running hard from a trail of violent crime. Investigators later said Sonner admitted that when he saw the patrol car behind him, he made up his mind right there. If an officer walked up to that window, he was going to kill him. That was the whole tragedy in one sentence. Borland was doing his job. Sonner had already decided how it would end. As Borland approached the Blazer, Sonner pulled a .38 revolver and shot him in the head. Borland never got the chance to draw his own weapon. A stop over stolen gas became the murder of a state trooper because the man in that driver's seat had reached the point where staying free for one more day mattered more to him than another person's life. Then Sonner ran, because men like that always seem to think they are smarter than consequences. He tore off into the Nevada desert and touched off a huge manhunt. By the next day, officers found the Blazer abandoned and tracked footprints toward the Clan Alpine Mountains. A helicopter spotted what looked like a campfire. SWAT teams moved in, and after roughly 25 hours on the run, Sonner was finally cornered. Reports said he raised his gun in a way that made it look like he wanted officers to shoot him, then dropped it and gave up. At trial, Sonner was convicted of first-degree murder, and in one of the strangest twists in the whole case, he even asked the jury to sentence him to death. They did. He spent more than 30 years on Nevada's death row before dying in prison in 2025. Number 1. Daryl Mack. Daryl Mack is what happens when a killer thinks one murder conviction is the end of the story, only to learn a second dead woman has been waiting for him the whole time. By the time Nevada sentenced him to die for the murder of Betty May, Mack was already serving life without parole for killing another woman, Kim Parks. Think about how ugly that is. One strangling had already put him away for good, and then DNA reached back into a cold case from 1988 and found another body with his name on it. Betty May was found dead in a basement room in Reno. She had been violently attacked and strangled, and for almost 12 years, her case went nowhere. No witness came running in to save the day. No confession dropped from the sky. The file just sat there, packed with evidence, waiting for science to get better and for Mack's luck to get worse. And that is exactly what happened. When investigators reopened the case and tested the biological evidence, the results did not just point in Mack's direction. They boxed him in. Semen recovered from Betty May matched him. Blood evidence matched him. Even material found under her fingernails matched him. After all those years, this was no longer some old Reno mystery. It was a dead woman, a sealed evidence trail, and a man who had already proven he was capable of doing the same thing twice. That is the part that makes Daryl Mack so disturbing. This was not one bad night, not one excuse, not one courtroom story about a man who lost control for a few minutes. By the time Betty May's case caught up with him, Mack had already murdered again. He did not just slip through the cracks once. He slipped through, killed another woman, and then got dragged back by the one thing he could not out-talk, outrun, or bury: DNA. Mack was charged with first-degree murder in Betty May's death, convicted and sentenced to die. Then the case took one more grim turn. He waived a jury, gave up more legal options later, and made it clear he would rather be executed than spend the rest of his life aging on death row. Most condemned men fight for every extra day they can steal. Mack looked at the calendar and basically decided he was done with it. So that is Daryl Mack in one sentence. A repeat killer who thought time had covered his tracks, until a box of old evidence reopened the case and finished what the first conviction had started.